Our guest tonight is Linda Godfrey, and when you talk about some of the different things that we talk about on this show, I mean, we talk a lot about ghosts, we talk a lot about UFOs, we talk a lot of strange and unusual things, but we always seem to have a difficult time getting really into the discussion of the creatures. You know, in some cases we're talking about cryptids, which, you know, they may be legitimate scientific flesh and blood creatures, and then there's also the ones that are more of the mythological folklore aspect, and then there's that line in the middle where the two of them meet. And our guest tonight, Linda Godfrey, she walks that line quite a bit. She is an author, investigator, and artist with a penchant for lapso-apsos and werewolves. So, hey, there you go. That sounds like your perfect woman, Moniz.
I used to have losses as a kid.
And you're a werewolf, so it works out well. Her books include Weird Wisconsin and Weird Michigan, as well as the sequel Strange Wisconsin and Strange Michigan, The Poison Widow, The Beast of Bray Road, Hunting the American Werewolf, and of course her latest book is about. We're talking about some really intriguing stuff with her latest work. So let's bring her on, and we'll have her talk about it with us. We are happy to welcome to the program Linda Godfrey. Good evening, Linda. How are you?
Great to be with you.
Oh, we're so thrilled to have you. I mean, we've been reading your stuff for years, and we've been talking about your work on the show, so we're glad we could finally get you here.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Now, the title of the new book is what?
Real Wolfmen, True Encounters in Modern America.
So, basically, it's a listing of all the Moniz relatives that are out there.
Well, and it's more than a listing. What they actually, Tarcher Penguin asked me to do was put together what I thought were the very best encounter reports from the first 3 books that I wrote on this topic, and then add in speculation and some of the best theories. So it's sort of the best of the best, and, you know, as many as I could cram into that book. You know, I had a word count limit, unfortunately. But I think people will still be amazed at how many are in there, and especially to know that there are many, many more in the other books that did not make it in. And that doesn't even count the ones that have come in over the past year since I turned in that manuscript.
Well, I think what's interesting is if you follow along with your career and your writing, is you're starting off writing for some smaller publishers, and now you're writing books about this topic for publishers like Penguin. It just goes to show that there is an audience out there for this stuff, right, which means that there must be a massive amount of sightings coming in these days.
There are lots. It's been 20 years since I started, back with the original newspaper story that broke the news of the Beast of Bray Road. And I still get an average of 1 to 3 reports a week. You know, sometimes it's none, but other times it'll be 5. Usually 1 or 2. And I just find that amazing, that after all these years, people are still finding me and saying, it's really good to finally talk to someone who won't think I'm crazy. I saw this thing. You know, they're just all so similar.
Well, now, to those who follow along with Creature Stories, The Beast of Bray Road is a seminal story, but why don't you share for those who might not be familiar what exactly that is all about?
Well, I was working and had really just started as a reporter for the Walworth County Week, which was a newspaper in southeastern Wisconsin, and somebody tipped me off that people around my own hometown of Elkhorn, Wisconsin, were saying that they were seeing what they described as a werewolf on this 2-mile country road called Bray Road, just east of town. And they were, to my surprise, phoning in the reports to the county animal control officer. And, of course, I was very skeptical, but I thought to myself, well, when you are planning a hoax, you don't usually notify the authorities and leave your address and your phone number, you know, where they can grab you and charge you with fraud later on. So that intrigued me, and the officers shared with me those names and addresses. And when I began to visit and interview these people, I discovered to my surprise that they did not seem crazy. They did not seem like liars. I was impressed with the variety of people. There were everything from old, young, women, men, blue-collar, white-collar, farmers, you name it. They were all, it was this cross-section of people. And the creature they described was pretty consistent, whereas you'd think if people were having individual hallucinations, there's no reason for everybody to be seeing the same thing. Many of them were unaware that other people had seen it. So I thought this really had enough of a basis that it deserved a story, and I thought if nothing else, people needed to know that there was a possibly dangerous predator-type animal in the area, and perhaps even if it was only what turned out to be the beginning of some new folklore, that deserved to be recorded too.
Mm-hmm.
The thing happened to go national in 2 weeks, however, which was really unanticipated. I never in my wildest dreams thought that would happen. And then I never really got over the fact that over the 10 years I wrote for that newspaper, it never stopped. People, and that was before, the early 90s was before we had Twitter and Facebook, and
mm-hmm.
really most people weren't even doing email back then. So they had to work some to find me, and write the newspaper. And I even at one point tried foisting off all my files on the local library and having people write to them, but that didn't work out. They wanted to talk to me. So after 10 years, I quit the paper and went back to teaching part-time so that I could write books.
Well, as you said, though, this was at a time period where they had to work to find you, and that means they also had to really work to find these stories. I mean, newspapers, of course, were a lot different business back then. There were a lot more people reading them every day, but it's not like the Internet where things just kind of take off on a message board and then people want to be part of the story.
Right.
I mean, this had to be something that was very organic.
Yeah, it was, and most of the time people would hear about me second or third hand. They'd hold stories in for years, and then they'd finally tell their cousin, and their cousin would say, "Oh, well, you haven't heard of the Beast of Bray Road," and then they would just, track down the story and find me. I mean, there was the Internet. You could search. I'm not even sure we had Google then. I think the top engine might have been. I'm not even sure what it was at the
Probably
time.
Alta Vista back then, or something even before that.
It's like ancient history.
But I mean, there was an internet, but I mean, how many people actually had access to it, and how many people that could find it knew how to use it?
Exactly. So it was just surprising, and I got letters from not just Wisconsin, but all over the United States and other countries. I remember getting one from the Virgin Islands, telling me about something similar there. People were telling me that their relatives who had been in World War I and World War II saw upright canine-type creatures in the countryside of France and Germany, and had just told certain family members. So it was just an amazing revelation for me to realize that I had stumbled onto something that was not just a little local sideshow story. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and I thought that it deserved to be recorded. I did not know what it might turn out to be or where it would take me, but that somebody needed to be keeping track of these things. So I kind of call myself the accidental werewolf chronicler.
Well, now, how do you go about, though, continuing that? Because, as you said, you're going to have these continued sightings of what's in your area, but how do you start piecing together the pieces? How do you start putting together all the pieces of all these stories that are not only in your area, but kind of internationally? There's been werewolf sightings throughout history.
Right. And I actually wrote one book called Werewolves for Chelsea House in New York that deals more with the history, and I kind of give an abbreviated version of it in each of the other books, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that does go back. The idea of part wolf, part man, although I don't think that's what these creatures are, goes, back thousands and thousands of years to our earliest civilizations. It's something that seems to have always been around. And it's really hard to analyze the ones that are, 5,000 or 6,000 years old, but you can go back and see the pictures that are left, drawn on rocks, back in old Anatolia or present-day Turkey, for instance, or the ancient Egyptian gods, such as Anubis, which had a jackal head. So there's the history aspect, but then what I try to do when I get sightings, and oftentimes they come about because people hear me on radio shows like yours or Coast to Coast AM or Dreamland, that sort of thing, or sometimes, every time one of my new books comes out, it triggers another landslide of sightings. Whenever there's a triggering event where people can hear about it, then they write me or find me somehow or another. But when I get these reports, what I like to do, and I do this more and more, I wish I had started out this way, but I immediately, well, of course we didn't have the mapping resources that we have now. Now we have Google Earth, and it's so easy to just map out what geographical features are nearby, and you can map them in comparison to other sightings. I also look for human artifacts, such as cemeteries, military installations, roadways, types of forests, that kind of thing. Or I should say old sacred sites that are in forests, that kind of thing. Because I find really weird commonalities with these aspects, too. You know, there are certain habitats that seem preferred and certain areas of human habitation that also appear to attract these creatures, or at least seem to be major sighting hotspots.
Well, I mean, what are some of the commonalities in these locations?
Well, geographically, the big common denominator is water. And you can look at that two ways. If they're natural animals, of course, they're going to need water, especially if they're carnivores and have a lot of protein to digest. It's really, really important. But then if you look at many of these types of places, crossroads, cemeteries, even military installations, they're the exact same spots that are hot spots for Great Britain's phantom black hounds and many European and in other countries too, sites where supernatural encounters take place. So this is the big bugaboo that's followed me for 20 years, is every time I think I have evidence to show that it's probably a natural creature that somehow adapted to walk upright, then I'll get a flurry of sightings that have these other aspects to them, and vice versa.
Well, that's what's very interesting about your research, is you have put a lot of work and time into the idea that they could be just some sort of wolf or canine or some sort of creature of that ilk that's been able to adapt to walking like humans. And I mean, I don't really see the possibility of that without it being a huge leap in the evolution of those creatures from the common types that we see.
Right, you know, and again, I have to stress that this is strictly my conjecture and speculation. I don't claim to be laying out any kind of scientific proof or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply my trying to take it a different way and say, well, what would be the advantages if a canine did start walking upright? Because after all, it's not an impossible physical activity. It's not like they're suddenly sprouting wings and flying. You can go on YouTube and find all kinds of walking dogs that can walk and run perfectly well upright if they're trained and motivated to do so while in captivity, or sometimes in the wild if they lose a forelimb, you know, and it's the only, although it's really rare for that to happen in the wild, and of course most of these sightings are of obviously feral, you know, or wild creatures. So, you know, the idea of the missing forelimb, which is always brought up to me, doesn't really make too much sense. Usually what happens is that an animal that severely injured cannot hunt and doesn't live long, much less be able to, you know, produce. However, you know, just in my own mind, thinking it through, it occurred to me, for one thing, there's a major concentration around the Great Lakes prairie states. And what if at some point a natural dog or wolf hybrid combination found itself able to see farther across the prairie grasses if it stood on its hind legs, discovered that it could carry its prey in its forelimbs, and instead of inefficiently dragging it along on the ground where other things could come and try and get at it, you know, there would actually be some advantages. And the more that it did that, neuroscientists will tell you that your brain cells develop and learn new patterns when you expose them to different activities. So perhaps that would make them more intelligent, more elusive. You know, and again, this is just speculation. I had one reviewer say that I was trying to prove a scientific case, and nothing could be further from the truth than that, because I really don't claim that there's any great science to this. But logically, you could argue that if this were the case, creatures that have somewhat longer paws would probably have an advantage, because it would be easier to hold things and they would be able to balance easier. And that's one thing that people do say. Witnesses who observe these creatures will say, well, they had paws. I could see very long claws, but they seemed a little bit longer than a normal dog's or wolf's paws would be. And indeed, that is one of the best types of evidence we have, is the footprints that are left behind. And they just seem like extremely large wolf prints. In fact, I measured some myself that were 6.5 inches wide, which is huge. Even for the largest timber, it's larger than the largest timber wolf prints would be. And sometimes they even show, if the prints show an animal caught springing after a deer, and we have some examples like that too, there will be an additional imprint from the bone that we would compare with our heel and ankle joints, sometimes kind of bending down to give it an extra spring. So I can see that there are advantages and possibilities, and it wouldn't even really need to be a huge difference in species or anything like that, just sort of an adaptation for longer paws, greater size, and perhaps this accumulated knowledge, because it's shown that wolves do teach their young certain things, and it might be partly physically adapted and partly sort of a passed on, I hate to say cultural trait, but behavioral trait would be it. And the thing is that these things don't look part human. They have completely canine features. It's just their behavior of walking and running upright, using their paws in ways that you wouldn't expect them to. And then the third thing is they seem to have this attitude or uncanny intelligence that really freaks people out. They feel that the creature feels superior to them, or they'll say, well, I felt it was really angry that I saw it. That's not something you say if you see a bear. You don't say, well,
right.
I saw this bear, and it was really mad that I saw it. Bears don't care if you see
He's
them.
mad if you don't give him that picnic basket.
Yeah, exactly. They want the picnic basket, or they want you to leave their cubs alone. They're not mad that you saw them, and they're also really pretty easy to get on camera, where these things are not.
All right, well, we're coming up on the end of the first hour here. We have to take a news break. Thanks, Red Sox. But we'll be back coming up in the second hour after the news, Linda, and we can get a little bit further into in-depth in this. And we'll also take calls from the listeners, 508-996-0500, 1-877-996-1420. We'll be right back after the news here on Spooky South Coast. Because we were having a fascinating discussion about some of her work, especially in the realm of werewolves and the Beast of Bray Road in particular, which is where she got her start. One thing that I've always wondered, Linda, with these werewolf stories that we hear, is you had mentioned in the first portion of the program that the reports are usually of strictly canine features for these creatures. Is the human wolf, the lycanthropy picture that we now know is a real medical condition, but is the human wolf hybrid face, is that a creation of Hollywood?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really, really is. The idea of Jack Nicholson or Lon Chaney Jr. sprouting whiskers and going through this torturous, nasal change from a nose to a muzzle and sprouting all the fur and the legs changing, that would have to involve so many changes at the cellular level down to the DNA that, it sort of boggles the mind. Now, it's interesting because people who are afflicted with this psychological condition of lycanthropy, and sometimes this is also can be induced by certain psychotropic drugs, they may look in the mirror or look down at their arm and see fur sprouting. They may look and see staring back at them the face of a werewolf, but unless the other people with you have partaken of LSD or something else like that, which is just a few rare examples that I've found of that, they're not going to see anything except a human. And for instance, there's somebody who lives in a halfway house outside of just in Walworth County, who will occasionally, I've learned, go off of his meds and believe that he is the Beast of Bray Road and will jump on people's cars naked. And when they call 911, they're not saying there's a werewolf on my car. They're saying there's a crazy naked guy on my car. So you kind of see the difference.
I think I'd rather find a werewolf on my car.
Yeah. But it really, to me, doesn't translate. And I do have people, and I give them all respect because everybody walks their own path in life, and I don't know what these people are really going through, but they write and insist that they need to be chained in the basement every full moon, and that they go through this transformation, and that if left alone, they would be out running around, eating small mammals and things like that. And I always say, well, if that's true, next time, set up a camera on a tripod and tape yourself or video yourself going through the transformation and send it to me. And I have yet to receive the first one. And the thing is, if people were really able to do that in the numbers that they seem to claim, it would be all over YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Well, one question that I do have, and I know I'm going to butcher this because I'm not up to date on my medical terminology, but what about congenital hypertrichosis?
Right. That is a condition where you have a purely human, totally otherwise normal human being who just happens to have a bad case of the hairiness. And that, they're covered, 96 to 98% of their body is covered with thick fur. Sometimes they even need to get operations to get it taken out of their ears and noses so they can hear and breathe. It's that thick, and it's very startling to see a human like this. There's a whole family of them from Mexico, the Gomez family, who've kind of taken advantage of it by becoming circus performers and actors. And there's another one known as Hair Boy from China who are current. And these creatures, they're not even creatures, they're humans. These people turn up from time to time in history. You see them sort of made into human pets in medieval courts in Europe. But the thing is, it's quite a rare condition. There aren't enough of them to account for all the sightings. And they don't go out usually and live in the woods. They're very civilized. They're humans just like you and I. They're smart. They can play musical instruments. They like the comforts of, modern plumbing and heating and all that. And they don't look like animals. If you shaved them, you wouldn't be able to tell them from a normal human. So it's not like they, and the hallmark of these dogman or wolfman sightings is that people will say, I saw tall pointed ears on top of the head, I saw a long muzzle, it was covered with fur, but I saw fangs, I saw claws, I saw paws, not hands, and even though it was running well on its hind legs, it seemed to me that its legs were bent backwards because they're noticing the fact that canines run digitigrade or on their toe pads with what we would compare to the heel and ankle up off the ground where we're expecting to see a knee. So it looks backwards, but it's really just the canine anatomy. So there's a real difference. One is the canine species, one is the human, and you really, you might be startled, you might think that you'd probably be more likely to think that it was a juvenile Bigfoot, if anything, if you ran into one of these hairy people in the woods.
Well, and that's, I think, it's too easy to take a look at some of these rare disorders that affect people and place the blame on that.
Exactly.
For these sightings that happen, especially when you're talking about not only the canine features and the canine mannerisms, but you're talking about, in some of the attacks that were reported over the years, a basic viciousness that probably goes beyond what a human being would be capable of.
Right, yeah, they're vicious, and not only that, they're just so widespread and going back so many, many decades, that it's just impossible for one scenario like that to account for all of these sightings.
Now, is there, when you're looking at these reports of these man wolves instead of wolfmans, we'll say, but when you're seeing these two-legged creatures, or when you're hearing reports of these two-legged creatures, what is probably the most astronomical part of the reports, because I think if you're somebody who says, well, I don't believe in any of this stuff, you're more likely to believe in the idea that a canine type creature can develop the ability to walk on two legs than you would be to think that, you know, a human being can morph into one.
Right.
But there must be still some extraordinary things that are reported in terms of these sightings.
Well, there are, you know, and again, probably the greatest percentage, probably well over 95% of the sightings don't involve anything that a natural canine could not do. You know, as I've said, they can easily walk on their hind legs if they're motivated or trained to do so. It's just that normally in the wild, neither of those things happens. You know, so we're not talking about them doing anything supernatural. However, once in a while, there's a sighting, there's one classification I call the bedroom invaders, where people will see an upright dog-like creature, usually they're jet black in this case, and have red glowing eyes instead of the normal yellow-green that most people associate with the other type of sighting, with the more natural type of sighting. And they look around, they disappear into thin air, and they generally act more like the great black phantom hounds of Great Britain. So, to me, they probably aren't the same phenomenon, you know, and I've said in several of my books that just because you have a dog or wolf-like creature on its hind legs doesn't mean that every single one of these is the same phenomenon or coming from the same origin or source. So, you know, I do think it's possible that we've got a couple of different things thrown in the mix.
I think that when you look at some of the stories that you hear, I mean, obviously some of them are mistaken animal sightings. You know, some of them are going to be
right.
Perhaps somebody's not familiar with what a coyote or a wolf might look like in the wild, or
a bear standing up on trying to reach something out of a branch on a tree.
Sure. I mean, there's probably a lot of misidentification in these, but I'm sure you're getting reports from people who are trained hunters, people who spend a lot of time in the woods, people who know the difference, especially when it comes to tracking.
Right. Yeah, and they don't always leave tracks. Often, if they're on the roadway, you know, the surface is too hard, or actually, a good surface for taking tracks is sort of rare. You need a really nice firm soil or clay or packed sand, something like that, in order to get a good print. Although they do show up occasionally, you know, and I've gotten them myself. But the thing is, people who get a good look at this creature, or Bigfoot, and I do get Bigfoot reports too, are usually quite clear and quite firm and convinced about what they saw, you know. And for instance, in Wisconsin, they'll say, I've seen bears, and most people in Wisconsin have seen bears. It's not in the wild, at least in the zoo. I know what a bear looks like. This was not a bear. And in fact, one thing that I hear over and over is what I call the flip chart effect, where people will encounter these creatures, and they start this flip chart in their mind. Is it a bear? Is it a wolf? Is it a dog? No, no, no. Until they finally run to the end of the flip chart, and there's nothing left, and they have to say, I don't know what that thing is. And that's when the deep fear of the unknown sets in. That's when they step on the gas or run or, you know, do whatever they need to get out of the situation. And, you know, I've had men who were, you know, 6'3", trained hunters and woodsmen and former Army veterans, combat veterans, who have said things to me like, you know, Linda, at that minute, I was not a man. I was a little girl, you know, screaming for my life. And it's this, and I think part of it is not even necessarily what the creature is doing, but the realization that they're facing something that seems impossible and that they can't, you know, neatly stack into any known column, you know, of known creatures. And that's what really scares them so much.
Well, now you had mentioned Bigfoot, and I know that you've done some research into that as well.
Right.
Are there a lot of overlay in the areas where these Wolfmen and the Bigfoot sightings occur?
Well, you know, it's interesting because usually where you find one, you'll find the other. And I found this out from mapping things out, you know, and comparing it. for instance, southeastern Wisconsin is a good example. You find both Bigfoot and the Dogman in pretty good abundance, more than you would think in this sort of a habitat. But they seem to sort of divide themselves into little territories where within a certain bandwidth of going through 3 counties, I can pretty much tell you between here and here, it's going to be likely to be a Bigfoot sighting, and then if you get to this side of a creek and the other side, it's going to be Dogman. So they seem to be sort of territorial, and I've been studying one area in another county for almost a year now. It's just a small stretch of country road with farms, and we've had Bigfoot tracks, Dogman tracks. That's where I was measuring those 6.5-inch Dogman prints just a few months ago, where you could see it was tracking a deer through a cornfield and had a scuffle, and the deer got away and went one way. I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating and scary to think, wow, I can see there was something with 6.5-inch wolf prints, and this was firm soil, not mud that was spreading out, so there was no question of them spreading to be larger. And I can see it was chasing a deer right here. And then across the street, we had 14-inch Bigfoot prints that we followed for nearly a mile into the field that just sort of ended. We couldn't tell where it went. It seemed to vanish into thin air. So there you have them both in the same row. And to me, it seems to tell a story, because the Dogman prints started being seen later, that maybe they were trying to encroach on the good hunting territory of these cornfields where the deer like to cluster and eat corn. And it's my theory that both the Bigfoot and the Dogman like to go in there, and they can find deer, possums, raccoons, everything likes to be in there eating the corn, and they can get around places that they can't the rest of the year without being seen.
Well, that elusiveness definitely seems to be key for their existence.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder, too, I mean, if they are in close proximity to each other, and we wonder how they interact with humans, you got to really wonder how they interact with each other.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have a feeling that they don't like each other. I really do. Because you never see them walking along side by side, that's for sure.
That brings me to a question. How many reports do you get of multiple creatures sightings?
Not as many as the single. The typical sighting is a single creature crossing the road or running alongside the road or suddenly being encountered out in the wilderness. But there are enough that it makes a sizable quota or part of a sizable percentage, I think is what I was trying to say. I've had people see 2 creatures running along a road together. That was in upstate New York. I've had a group of people see 3 of them together kneeling almost like a human would kneel and drinking water by bringing it in their elongated paws up to their muzzles rather than sticking their nose in, and lapping like a regular dog would do. One of the most chilling is in my new book, Real Wolfmen, and tells about the sighting just a few years ago in Palmyra, Maine, by a middle-aged professional couple who were sitting on their front porch one night drinking coffee about 10:30. They had a big spotlight because they had a pond that deer would often come to in the nighttime, and they would occasionally shine the light and see if there were any deer to look at. And they got this terrible feeling. They threw the flashlight out onto the yard, and there they saw 5 upright canine-like creatures advancing on them, and they were only about 20 feet away, just creeping toward them on the lawn. And they were able to back into the house. The husband had a gun, but it was locked in the garage where his wife made him keep it. So he, had no weapons. And they actually called 911. And the 911 operator told them to call the game warden. The game warden told them to stay in the house all night and lock the doors, which, of course, they weren't about to go out running around. So they went upstairs to where their daughter was sleeping and looked out the window and shone the flashlight down at the yard, and 5 pairs of green-yellow eyes reflected back up at them.
Wow.
And the creatures stayed there, and they were 7 feet tall. They were able to ascertain because they passed in front of a shed roof or a shed door that they were able to measure later on to find out how tall they were. And they each drew sketches that are in the book I like to get witnesses to draw their sketches, even if they're not any artists, which most people claim that they're not. But, it gives me a better idea of the details and helps them to kind of think through also what they saw. But that one I found really, really scary.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I was going to ask you, when you're looking at all these reports and kind of putting them all together, can you glean what kind of level of intelligence and maybe even malevolence that these creatures have toward us?
They do seem more intelligent than you would expect a regular wild animal to be. All the witnesses say that. It appears that they can recognize what cameras are. They seem to shy away from them. They seem to be observing the people as much as the people are observing them, much more so than you would expect any wild animal to do. And they also do seem malevolent. People will say, I felt like, it really wanted to hurt me or eat me. I felt like it was lunch. They don't understand why it's restrained, or there have been instances where people have actually been chased out in the open, and they felt that the creature could have easily caught them if it wanted to, but at the last second, it always veers off into the underbrush or the cornfield or whatever's there as cover. And it seems smart enough that it is not caught out in the very open places without some sort of cover.
Now, have you made any correlations between sightings of these dogmen or wolfmen and hot spots for UFOs?
Yeah, it's kind of like, the late, great John Keel said, where you find one of these things, you find the other. He called them window areas, where Bigfoot would show up, other hairy humanoids, strange big flying birds, lake monsters, and UFOs all seem to frequent the same areas. And I've noticed the same thing. This one spot where we've got the Dogman and the Bigfoot, we've had some UFO sightings as well. And, I don't know why that is. Some people think that the creatures are coming out of the UFOs. Some people think that they're all manifestations of some type of earth spirit or geomagnetic energy that can interact with the human brain, and that perhaps we just have these idealized figures that are sort of hardwired into us, that we see Wolfmen and Bigfoot and shining lights in the sky when we interact with these either spirits or geomagnetic forces. And again, these are all theory and speculation. I can't vouch for one or the other, but you start to wonder after you notice that these things are occurring in clumps, and that they do seem attracted to ancient sacred sites. I've made some definite correlations in that area. Why is that? You don't find that sort of thing with gophers or foxes or coyotes. They just run wherever they want to run, wherever it seems like a good place for them to go. So why with these things? And why is it so hard to get a picture of them? I have so many witnesses that have seen them clearly in broad daylight at close range and have passed stringent polygraph tests that I believe the great bulk of the witnesses, once in a while there's a clinker in there, but the great bulk of the witnesses, I believe, are thoroughly honest, and yet we can't get pictures of them. But, if a bear comes into Madison and climbs a tree in someone's backyard and they see it, there are going to be videos of it all over the evening news.
Well, you said once in a while in those polygraphs you get a clinker, but I wonder if that's because
not in the polygraphs, but just in the letters that come to me.
Well, I was going to say, I wonder if some people have a problem with that because they don't believe what it is that they saw. It's hard to believe that you're telling the truth if you don't believe in what you saw.
And the other thing I find interesting, she's talking about these creatures and UFOs and whatever all happening in certain areas, like what we have here known as the Bridgewater Triangle.
Right.
There are these window areas, like she's saying, that happen in various spots around the country and around the world. So,
well, that was going to be one of my questions for you, Linda. Is we have a lot of reports, and we do have a call on the line. So just hang on a minute, caller. But we have a lot of reports here in what we call the Bridgewater Triangle of Bigfoot sightings, of those phantom dog type creatures, thunderbirds, different types of anomalous animals.
Right.
Have you ever heard of any of these dogmen sightings here in the Massachusetts area?
Yeah, I'm getting more and more from the East Coast, and right now, there isn't anyone that's popping forth and suggesting itself to me at the moment. But yeah, strangely, Maryland seems to be a hot spot, and now and I know Maine has had Bigfoot reports for a long, long time. So any place you have a well-watered area with some nice forest habitat and maybe a few nice fat farm animals or pets, both of these creatures actually seem more likely to grab pets than anything else, or chickens seem to be another favorite. But I did want to mention the polygraph tests. The very first episode of Monster Quest on History Channel was called American Werewolf, and it was based on my book, Hunting the American Werewolf. And they had me just round up 7 or 8 witnesses, whoever I could get that was handy, that didn't have to travel a long way. So they were a pretty motley crew. And then they brought in one of the best polygraph experts in Minnesota, who actually is freelances for a lot of the Minneapolis police departments when they need somebody really good. Every single eyewitness passed with flying colors.
Wow.
And the producers were shocked because there were a couple witnesses. There was this one young guy whose sightings seemed a little bit unusual compared to the other sightings, and they were sure he was going to flunk, and he showed absolutely no evidence of deception. And I was a little embarrassed to ask them, I thought, well, maybe they're going to think that I'm implying that they're lying about these things. But they all said, sure, I'll take whatever you've got. I know what I saw, and I'll tell anybody about it.
Well, Monster Quest is a great program, and we thank you for your contributions to it. Moniz and I had the dubious distinction of being on the one episode of Monster Quest that they like to pretend never existed.
Oh.
Yeah.
We were on the Ghosts episode,
Yeah.
Oh.
and it's the one that never gets rerun because every time they show it, there's such outcry on the internet. Ghosts are not a creature. They shouldn't be on Monster Quest.
Well, that's what was funny, because they kept rerunning that particular episode the first year when they filmed it, and hasn't been aired since.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's probably a DVD extra somewhere. But
I'll have to see if I can look that one up. I also was in the very final episode of season 4, so I was kind of the beginning and the ending when we went to Michigan and kind of debunked the Gable film hoax.
Well, we have a call on the line. If anybody wants to call in before the end of the program, the numbers are 508-996-0500, 1-877-996-1420. If you have any questions for our guest, Linda Godfrey, regarding some of these creatures. And it's not just Bigfoot. It's not just wolfmen and dogmen. It's all kinds of things. Sea serpents, all kinds of creatures. Even, the elusive Monizes that are out there in the wild. So let's go right to the phones. Good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast with Linda Godfrey. Could we have your name, please?
Hi, it's Gail.
Hi, Gail. How you doing?
Hi. Actually, I wasn't able to get through on the telephone, on my cell phone, so I decided to just call in. I didn't know, though, that you were talking about Bigfoot and stuff. I know nothing about Bigfoot.
Well, have you,
I know nothing. I don't believe Bigfoot exists.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think that it could even exist?
No. I
Why?
really don't.
Why do you think that?
I believe now in the supernatural since the death of my son, because I've had signs. But I don't really feel that there is actually some kind of a Bigfoot or a monster serpent or
Why? Why do you have that view? What brings you to that conclusion?
I guess that I feel that we would have seen it by now.
No, that's not true, because we discover close to 3,000 species per year, and some of them are quite large, including species of whales and sharks that are over 30 feet long.
And people are seeing it. It's seen really often. It's astoundingly often.
They are seen very often?
Yeah, if you ever check out any of the, just Google Bigfoot, and you'll just come up with so many amazing accounts.
The different. I thought that the big main one, wasn't it like in Europe somewhere?
Well,
where is Bigfoot
they're
supposed to be?
very similar. This is an interesting thing, too, is that there are very similar creatures, large anthropoid, ape-like creatures covered with fur all around the world. The Yeti is one. They have one in Russia. The outlands of China. There's, and they all have different names. And they also go back in Native American history, where almost every Native American tribe has some sort of name for them, whether it's the Oma or the Big Man.
So, in other words, do you
Skookum.
feel that like
Skookum, hairy
Yellowstone
breast
Park
bean.
got one?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do you feel any of our national parks have a Bigfoot?
They have been seen, in lots of national parks. There's actually a man, David Paulides, who's written a couple of books about the great numbers of disappearances of people from national park systems that he sort of hints might be related to Bigfoot snatchings, which I don't know if that's true or not. I have no idea. But he documents sightings in national parks. Michigan, for instance, has the Million Acre Manistee National Forest, which is just a hotbed for both sightings of Dogman and Bigfoot.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
What about Salt Fork in Ohio?
Oh, yeah. I was out there. I was a speaker at their last conference in May and was actually astounded at the number of sightings that have been in Salt Fork Lake Park. One man gave a presentation on them, and I was just amazed. There are just dozens and dozens.
Don Keating?
It was Doug Waller.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, Gail, thank you for calling in. Thank you. It's nice to finally hear the sound of your voice.
Yeah, hey. And I'm sorry it was on Bigfoot. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. You might want to tune in next week because we're going to have spirit mediums Tiffany Rice and Stephanie Burke here in studio, and they'll be taking some calls and giving some readings, so you might want to check that out.
That'd be neat because I'd know more about that than Bigfoot.
Sure. All right.
Nice chatting
and I
with
will
you.
study up on Bigfoot and Dogmen.
Thank you so much. You can get the book, The Real Wolfmen.
Okay.
Yeah. And I always tell people I think it's better to stay a little skeptical and just keep an open mind than to swallow everything.
There's a lot of stuff I've learned the past 3 years that I've never believed.
Right. It's amazing when you open your mind. You just become a lot more alert to things. And
No, I've got a lot to learn.
All right, well, thank you so much for the call.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Okay, thanks. Good night, Tim.
All right, and you're right, though, Linda. I mean, the problem is when you might enter into a certain subject not really having a belief that it can occur or that it can exist, and then what happens is you start chipping away at that a little bit, and then you don't know where to draw that line anymore, because how can you say that one thing that we're talking about that seems impossible can exist and another thing can't?
It's really true, and that's why I think it is good to just stay rational, and whether you're looking into the phenomena of ghosts or unknown humanoids or UFOs or whatever, I think the big thing to do is to always look for all possible mundane answers first.
Mm-hmm.
What known animal could this have been? Was that a ghost or was it a reflection coming from that window over there? That kind of thing. You really have to be very careful to rule out every possible mundane answer before you can even go there to the more unthinkable explanations.
But I think Gail had the right idea because she said she's willing to do the research and to look into it, and that's the key to anything that you don't understand. Right,
that's a very intelligent approach, and I think a combination of being open to the research and staying rational about it. Could it be something else, and ruling out other possibilities. Those are the two things that will keep you grounded.
Well, now I guess I should ask you kind of the million-dollar question, and that's, of all the encounters that you've written about, that you've researched, that you've taken in over the years, have you had your own personal encounter with one of these creatures?
Well, perhaps. It's hard to say exactly, but it was about 6 years ago, and I was on location with some witnesses and a History Channel cameraman on a deserted gravel road in rural Michigan, where several witnesses had seen both a 7-foot-tall gray-furred upright canine and a slightly shorter brown-furred one. And it was about 2:30 in the morning, 95 degrees, mosquitoes. We were in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there couldn't have been. If anybody was trying to hoax us in a fursuit, they were real severe masochists. Because I don't know how they could have survived the heat. But we kept seeing yellow eyes staring at us from the bushes, and something kept running around the outskirts of the spotlight. And at one point, something ran across the road just beyond the spotlight, and it momentarily illuminated the thing's back. And the back was vertical. There was gray fur I could see. And when it ran across the road, it blotted out a road sign that we measured it being 7 feet tall. So we knew it was 7 feet tall, it had gray fur, and it was vertical. And at that point, one of the witnesses also saw it and then immediately insisted we all leave. They just got really scared again because they'd had one of them chase their car at one point. So I may have seen the back of one. But, it's still hard for me with my reporter's hat to go beyond that and say, well, I know for sure it was a dog man, because I didn't see its head, I didn't see its arms or legs or paws or tail or anything else like that. But it does correspond with what the witnesses said, and, it certainly didn't look like any human running across the road.
And we did get a question from the chat room. Somebody wanted to know if there is any truth to the myth, to the folklore idea of the fact that the full moon is tied into a lot of these sightings.
Actually, I haven't ever found a big correlation between sightings and full moons. For one thing, a lot of the sightings are 2, 3, 10 years old, and people can't remember if it was a full moon or not, or they didn't notice, or it was overcast, And when they do, they're just as likely to say, it was not a full moon as it was. And personally, I think that if the full moon did have any effect, it would merely be to better illuminate the night so that people would be more likely to be able to see something. If you're driving along, there's a full moon, and it's gleaming on the snow or the fields, and everything's bright, and there's a creature, you're much more likely to see it than if it's one of those black nights where the only light is from your headlights.
I used to love those old B-movie horror movies from the 40s and 50s, and I'm not talking about the classic Universal monsters. I'm talking about, like, the ones where they just kept rehashing things later on.
Right.
And you'd see a scene where it's like a dark, stormy, foggy night with thunder and lightning, and then all of a sudden you'd see a full moon come out, and then there'd be more thunder and lightning, Just it was kind of like a little bit of whatever they needed.
Right, exactly.
Well, I think, too, that when you're looking at, you'd mentioned the idea that the full moon will illuminate and cause for more sightings. I think a full moon is probably more memorable to people, too, when they're having this encounter, because of the mythology associated with it.
That's a good point.
You might be like, oh, yeah, I checked, the moon was full, but then any other phase, you're kind of like, was it waxing, waning? I don't know the difference.
Right.
So are there certain... you said you'd mentioned certain locations, but are there certain environmental factors? Like, do you have more sightings in the summer or in the spring?
Probably they pick up around August and tend to peak around by the end of November. Between August and November are probably the greatest number of sightings, but they do occur all year round. I've had them occur in winter, in summer, day, night, although most of them, I once did a little survey of my own and found out that the bulk of them were between 10:30 p.m. and about 5 a.m.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you if they were a hibernating creature, but if you've had winter sightings, then probably not.
No, they do seem, I imagine they have to get out and forage just as they do other times, but I'm quite sure that it's probably a lot harder to get around without being seen in the winter,
And leaving tracks that are
and
significant.
leaving tracks, exactly. That's that time that we followed them for almost a mile into this series of cornfields where nobody knew we were going, by the way, and that was in January. and we had a well, we had kind of a January thaw. It was like 50 degrees, so the top layer of dirt had softened, and then the snow had melted down to like a crust on top of that. So we had really good conditions for footprints. And it was probably thinking, man, nobody's going to know I'm in this cornfield. I can just walk, Nobody's going to follow me here. But it just so happened that we saw the farmer's pit bull sniffing around in this odd place. And we thought, well, what's it interested in? And then we went over there and saw the first footprint, and then the next, and the next.
Now, have you ever found any kills or reports of any kills or other physical evidence like fecal matter or whatever that they could definitely tie to these animals?
No, I've had people turn in hair samples that turned out to be raccoon or cat. I've had a woman who heard something run on two legs across her roof and put its foot through and left 6-inch footprints in her flower bed when it jumped off the roof. And there was a large pile of some kind of scat up there with a turkey claw in it, which made you think, maybe it swallowed a lot bigger part of the turkey. And I dutifully collected that scat off of her roof by standing on a bar stool. Luckily, it was kind of a low roof.
It was on her roof?
Yeah, it was on her. Whatever it was had climbed up a tree that kind of abutted the back of her house, jumped onto her roof, and run across. She actually called the police because she thought maybe there was an escaped criminal running across her roof for some strange reason. Even though she would have been in an odd spot for a criminal to, want to go on her roof. But, and the policeman more or less made fun of her. But she called me, and we discovered this large pile of scat, and I took it to a friendly DNR agent, and he determined that it was from a raccoon. The reason it was so large was that raccoons' latrine, they like to go in the same spot over and over. So it very well could have been that it was a dog man, because I've had prints from around that area and other reports from very close to there chasing one of those raccoons, for all we know.
Well, I'll just throw it out there. Remember the paranormal poop, Monies?
On top of
the profile rock? On a little outcropping of rock at the top of a small rock formation. It's like a little rock hill. But it's in a very hard location for an animal to have gotten to. I mean, it's on such a little outcropping that sticks out that like no dog would have really been able to walk out there and take a squat. And
right.
A person I couldn't imagine would have done it either because of the odd angles that were involved.
Then again, you never know out there. But definitely not for a dog to get up this thing, because this thing, for all intents and purposes, had vertical sides that you had to climb, seriously climb.
So who knows?
You never know. But I've heard of people finding large piles of what they think is Bigfoot scat. It looks sort of human-like. Getting into the gross factor here now, but...
it's always a good way to end the program is talking about scat.
There you go. And I guess there are certain laboratory investigations allegedly pending for both scat and fur as regards Bigfoot anyway. So a lot of people are waiting, holding their breath for that one. Well, that's like we always say here when people ask us if we believe something. We say, well, does a Bigfoot poop in the woods? So, has to go somewhere. Exactly. Well, I think in talking about defecation and fecal matter, that's usually where we end the show. And sometimes that's where we start the show, too. But why don't you let people know, too, how they can get in touch with you if they want to share some more sightings that have happened since the book have come out. If they have an experience and they want to share it with you, how can they get a hold of you? Right. Well, the easiest way is to go to my website, lindagodfrey.com. And if you go on the About page, I think it's at the end of my bio, it tells you how to get, my email is listed there. You can also go to, although I have two kind of static sites that are sort of crumbling, beastofbrayroad.com and weirdmichigan.com, but you can still go and email me from the links there, so either one of those two, and they both still contain information that's worthwhile. But LindaGodfrey.com would be the main one to try.
And it's linked up right on the front page of SpookySouthCoast.com.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Glad to do it. Is there anything coming down the pipeline that you're working on now?
Well, I'm just in negotiations with Penguin to do a follow-up book that maybe has a little broader scope. I can't say much else about it.
Sure.
And I actually will be having my first fantasy novel released very soon, and it does not contain a werewolf or Bigfoot.
Nice. Well, we will look forward to that. But the current book is called Real Wolfmen, True Encounters in Modern America by Linda S. Godfrey. And again, check it out, LindaGodfrey.com. You can order the book and you can find out for yourself whether or not these Wolfmen are real. Thank you so much for joining us, Linda.
Oh, thank you.
Hopefully we can have you again sometime.
Anytime. It was my pleasure.
All right. Have a great night.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
It's so nice to finally get her on the show after reading her work for all these years and talking about her work. And we finally got to have her on the program, so thank you again for joining us. And I'm excited to get a copy of this book. I haven't received it yet. I know it's supposed to be coming, and I want to really delve into this and see the correlation between some of these reports, because it sounds like she's doing the right stuff, putting together all the geographic factors and everything else. So, well, that does it for this week's show. We'll be back next week with another program. We're going to have Tiffany Rice and Stephanie Burke, the spirit mediums that we use at our Legend Trips events, and the stars of Spirit Connections on Spooky TV, which is Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. We're going to have them on the program here to talk with us about their work, about some of the sites we're going to be examining for our Legend Trips events this October. And we're also going to take some calls and maybe give some readings out on the air as well. You can also tune into their show again Tuesdays at 7 on Spooky TV. And don't forget, Wednesdays at 9 o'clock now. We moved the show an hour back. Wednesdays at 9 o'clock is Spooky Crossroads with myself and Chris Balzano. So it's your way to stay spooktacular all week long as we head here into the Halloween season. So SpookySouthCoast.com, that's the place to find all the content. LegendTrips.com, that's the place to purchase tickets to the events. Until next week, we want you all to stay spooktacular.